By the time I joined SCERA, some members had already begun preserving electric railway equipment for operation at some time in the hopefully not too distant future. That really appealed to me. Even at just 16, it was clear to me that we were quickly losing streetcar and interurban lines. They were regularly being converted to buses, and that wasn't going to stop until they were all gone. Electric railway preservation in Southern California actually had its start in 1939 when PRS predecessor Railroad Boosters purchased the Los Angeles Railway's funeral car, Descanso. It all began with Railroad Boosters excursion number 14 on Sunday, February 5, 1939. One of the reasons for the hastily assembled excursion was that the 950, which was a one-of-a-kind streetcar, was going to be scrapped along with the Descanso. They simply had no need for these cars. When the excursion stopped at Los Angeles Railway's Division 2, the Descanso was spotted in the open for photos. The February 1939 issue of Railroad Boosters Bulletin Wheel Click stated, "Some of the juice fans who feel the Descanso is a relic worth preserving have petitioned the executive committee to take steps to secure it for the club and save the funeral car from its own funeral." Descanso was in fact saved by the Boosters and was at Summit and Cajon Pass from 1940 to 1967 when it was moved to the Orange Empire Railway Museum in Perris, California. The car's motors had been removed prior to sale, and there is no record of Railroad Boosters ever having an interest in operating the car. In the early 1950s, SCERA bought 3 Fort Collins, Colorado Bernie cars. Fort Collins streetcar lines were being discontinued, and the streetcars were being sold for $25 each. SCERA bought 3 cars but had to back out of the purchase when sufficient funds to transport the cars to Southern California could not be raised. Concurrently, the next phase in the preservation of Southern California equipment began with members of the SCER ranks acquiring equipment. In order to be as certain as I can be of the sequence of the acquisitions and to acknowledge the individuals responsible, I called Ray Balish to enlist his help with recalling the details. The call went like this. On August 3, 1953, the LATL 1160 was the first car to be acquired and was placed in the Travel Town exhibit at Los Angeles' Griffith Park. Ray made the primary financial contribution to the acquisition. City employee Charlie Atkins was founder of Travel Town and was very accommodating in letting us store the cars in an area just east of the main Travel Town location. The PE-1001 was also stored there. Railfan Walter Avenseth, who was responsible for saving many PE cars, purchased the 1001 on January 7, 1954 from the Pacific Electric for $1,546 including tax, FOB Pacific Electric Tracks, Torrance, California. This purchase was not connected to the SCERA. Ray recalled that LATL line car 9351 came in 1954. He, Dean Park, and a few others were in on the purchase. He went on to say he thought we then acquired a couple of LATL flat cars. The flat cars were $25 apiece. There was a flat car at South Park Shops and one at Vernon Yard. The LATL employee we were dealing with said the one at Vernon Yard was in the way. He said, "You get it out of there right away and you can have it." Ray rented a tow truck and had it moved to the corner of Vernon Yard on a piece of abandoned track. The track was a part of the 3-rail Santa Fe connection, the interchange track, and it sat there for a month or so. Both flat cars are out at the museum. After the flat cars, the LATL 525 and the LATL 2601 were acquired. In the spring of 1955, we acquired the last of nearly 1,000 Huntington Standard cars that had roamed the streets of Los Angeles. Purchased from LATL for $200, car 525 was built in 1906 and was featured on the SCERA fan trip on March 27, 1955. The car was moved to Travel Town soon after that last run of a Huntington Standard. The acquisition of 2601 came shortly after the 525. It too had a $200 price tag. Purchase of Power Car 9209 followed the 2601. The 9209 was used to haul work trains and perform light switching at Vernon Yard. The Los Angeles Railway built it in 1913. The LATL 1201 was in Centinela Park in Inglewood for only about 10 days, and the locals destroyed it. With the blessings of the city of Inglewood, Owl Trucking hauled it out of there. One of the first projects was to re-roof the car. As I recall, Pat Underwood financed much of the material cost. The labor was free. Owl charged $200 for these moves. Seems that the trucking and the car was about the same price. I remember it cost $200 to buy it and $200 to move it. Ray recalled it was about that time that railfan friend Jim Bugs Bergier brought his old 1919 Bulldog Mack truck to Traveltown. He needed a place to store it, and we were able to use it as needed. Henry Marquardt recalls that Bugs bought the Mack to move the PE 00197 he and Jack Ferrier bought from the PE to Jack's backyard in Temple City. The 00197 was the then recently retired West Hollywood Shops switcher. The Mack had a winch-driven cable that made it a useful vehicle for moving the 00197 and moving stuff around while we were at Traveltown. Ray said they would hang someone's current license plate on it and then drove it down to LATL's Division 3 a couple of times. For $25 they could get 2 lengths of rail and the appropriate amount of ties. He recalled driving down San Fernando Road with no binders for the load. They told the guys that helped them load the material at the LATL yard that it was held down by the gravity method. Ray mused that would not go today. The lengths of rail and ties were used to build storage track in our area of Traveltown for the growing collection. The LA Railway 9400 car body that we used as a clubhouse also came to our part of Traveltown on the Mack truck, and it was later transported to Perris on the Mack as well. But more on that later. Bugs also was a principal owner of the DDT, or Double Deck Transit, a late 1920s, early 1930s era Fifth Avenue Motor Coach Company double-deck bus. The New York veteran was used in a Hollywood movie and was purchased from the studio shortly after production was completed. It was great fun to take it to Hollywood Boulevard on New Year's Eve. We'd then drive it to Pasadena and park it on a side street off Colorado Boulevard for a front row seat at the Rose Parade. Ray went on to say Walter Abenseth and Norman Newcomb bought PE Officer's Car 1299. It was out at the San Bernardino car house and it mysteriously appeared. Everything was done in secret before any of us other kids knew about it, he said. About the same time, the Southern Pacific donated Pacific Electric Freight Motor 1624 to the Los Angeles chapter of the National Railway Historical Society. Both the 1299 and 1624 were stored at the Los Angeles County Fairgrounds before coming to Perris. Ray thought the progression of red car acquisition after the PE 1001 and PE 1299 was the Watts cars, the 5050s, or maybe it was the 314. Ray says this was for the most part Walter's doing. Walter and Ray bought the 314 in early 1960. They went half and half on it, though Ray was a silent partner. They paid $1,200 for the car. Ray remembered going down to Security Pacific Bank and withdrawing $1,200. As the teller laid out the $1,200, Ray said he had never seen so much money before or had so much money in his hand. Ray then got a money order made out to the Pacific Electric and the next day went over to the engineering department and paid for the car. He took the bill of sale to Long Beach and met with Ted Humerick. Ray described him as a gravel-voiced old foreman down there. Ray went on to say Ted was a hell of a nice guy, a true rail fan, but wouldn't admit it. On a handshake, Ted had the 314 billed over to the PE's Long Beach freight station. When the car arrived there, the inspector said the coupler had to be blocked, the coupler height increased with shims under the radius bar, tie down the trolley poles, and a few other small items. With all that done, the car was put in a freight train and went up the 4 tracks to Butte Street Yard. The Santa Fe switcher came into Butte Street, picked up the car before dark, and took it to their 8th Street yard. The Santa Fe yardmaster told Ray the car was going out that night and would be in San Bernardino by morning. He remembers waking up in the 314 while rolling through Santa Ana Canyon, stating the car rides like a Pullman. In the middle of the night, the 314 was dropped off right in front of the San Bernardino station. The San Jac local showed up before noon and the car was in Perris not much more than 24 hours after he had left Long Beach. Ray recalls that the cost of the move was under $100. He also recalls being told by the Santa Fe that he had to purchase a ticket to ride the car as a caretaker. He went to Union Station and was actually able to purchase a Santa Fe passenger ticket from Los Angeles to Perris for somewhere around $2. As you might suspect, no one asked him for the ticket. Ray noted that railfan Ernie Haas rode with him on this move without a ticket. As for the 50/50s purchased in 1960, they were $175 each plus tax, 4%. Ray went on to say the yellow cars were generally $200 apiece, though Ray thinks the line car 9351 was $150 or something like that. They had received a little discount, as he put it. The most expensive yellow car was the LATL 9550, the little shop switcher. Ray said he paid $500 for it and couldn't recall how he got caught in the deal, as he put it, but anyway, that was the price. Take it or leave it. $500. That car never went to Travel Town. We believe it was used as South Park shops until the end. That would be into the 60s, and we were at Perris by then. As for two of the three LATL PCCs, they were leased from the LAMTA for $1. This took place at an LAMTA board meeting. Ray recalled that he and Jim Walker were pictured in an article featuring the transaction in the LAMTA newsletter. Once all the heightened activity over the conversion to buses had died down and all of the remaining cars had been disposed, the board made a motion to sell the 3001 and 3100 to us for $1. Ray recalled that the price for the 3165 was $2,500. 5 people put in $500 each. The only person Ray could remember contributing other than him was railfan Bob Korek. Ray said Walter paid about $1,200 for the PE 418. It came out to Perris in a Santa Fe freight train along with the SD and AE Combo 175. We finished the conversation with a few moments of reminiscing about our experiences railfanning Southern California in the early days. Ray remembered the time motorman Howard 100% Smith letting you run the Bellflower car and how your knees were knocking.
They were. Oh boy, what a thrill. Now, I could care less about operating, but then it was fun. It was forbidden.
I know.
It was a good time.
You know, when people ask me out at the museum, did you guys ever think that it would grow to be this big and how successful and Thomas the Tank Engine and truck shows and all this? And I said, all we really cared about is we wanted a place where we could go put up a pole and go run a streetcar and not have to ask permission.
That's right.
That's really
exactly.
That is exactly it. And then, of course, when I follow up is I say, now it's 50 years later or more, and I still have to ask permission because I got to get qualified and take G-Core tests and all that. So here it is. I'm still asking permission. What have I gained through this whole thing?
It's been fun.
Before long, red cars were stacked 4 high at the National Metal and Steel scrapyard on Terminal Island, along with rows of yellow cars. The last of the last runs were playing out. It was time for the equipment preservation conscious members of SCERA to form a separate organization with the purpose of establishing an operating trolley museum. 14 members of SCERA gathered at the home of Ronald Longworth on the evening of March 23, 1956, to discuss such an organization. At that meeting, they chose the name Orange Empire Traction Company, adapting the name of an early Pacific Electric excursion through the inland empire of San Bernardino, Redlands, and Riverside. At the first meeting, Pat Underwood was elected president. Jim Walker was selected as secretary, and Dick Burns became treasurer. President Underwood appointed a committee to draft a set of articles of incorporation and investigate the legal aspects of incorporation. The second meeting was held 5 weeks later on April 29th at the home of member Jeff Moreau in Hollywood. At that meeting, the group adopted what they called the project system for managing acquisitions, restorations, and everything else that would have to be done. Early issues of the group's newsletter, the Orange Empire Traction Gazette, were filled with progress reports on one project or another. The project system was a method of classifying and numbering the many activities and projects that would be carried out by the new organization. Each activity was numbered, usually based on when it was begun. The hope was that it would aid in record-keeping and tracking progress. Projects 1 and 2 were large and represented the overall mindset of the group, even before they began to formalize the organization. The following is quoted from the first issue of Traction Gazette in July of 1956. Project 1. This project consisted of many trips taken to possible museum sites, and Project 2 was a title search of property ownership at one of the sites under consideration. Indeed, the search for a suitable site for the museum would take another 2 years, and it consumed a good deal of time on the part of many members. It's clear that the group did not consider the situation at Traveltown to be a permanent solution. On June 10, 1956, at a meeting in the home of Jim Walker in Linwood, the group adopted Articles of Incorporation. The 3 members who were at least 21 years of age and thereby eligible to sign a legal document signed the document. Those members were Richard Burns, Norm Johnson, and Pat Underwood. Jim Walker's father, Jim Walker Sr., notarized the signatures. A little over a month later, on July 20, 1956, the state of California granted a charter of incorporation as a nonprofit educational organization to the Orange Empire Traction Company. The museum's official address for the next few years was the Walker home on Josephine Street in Linwood. The museum was officially in business. Now that we were incorporated and off and running, we had a lot to do. Ray Balish, Bill Bauer, Don Brown, Pat Underwood, and Harvey Lehner worked at loading the Division III shop truck acquired from LATL into Ray's truck. The red pickup truck used in this operation belonged to my dad's family business, the Appliance Doctor. We all pitched in where we could. As the search for a museum site continued, Traveltown at Griffith Park was our home base. Respected members of the local rail fan community, Lazir Israel and Alan Stiffey, were among the regular visitors. One of our many projects as we made preparations for our anticipated departure from Traveltown was the move of the remains of the P.E. Sierra Vista station that had ended up in Traveltown out of the way using Bugs's 1919 Bulldog Mack truck. We did make time for fun. As long as there were streetcars still running, the streets of Los Angeles were our playground. Bill Bauer in his 1928 Model A Ford pickup truck has some fun pacing a P car on East 1st Street as recorded by Harvey Lehner from the back of Ray Balish's pickup truck. During 1957, the city notified us that the construction of the Ventura Freeway was about to commence and the ability to move our cars out of Traveltown area would be shut off. We were at a point where we would have to move out or stay indefinitely. Clearly, we planned to build an operating trolley museum somewhere. The search for a museum location took on a sense of urgency. There were several sites that were considered at that point. One of them was a quarry spur off the Santa Fe's Elsinore line just south of Corona. Porphyry was the Santa Fe point where the Elsinore line took off, so we referred to it as the Porphyry site. There were a couple of spurs, one to a quarry and one to an orange grove, perhaps a packing house. Porphyry was a real serious consideration, perhaps for a while our strongest possibility, but we were concerned about development. Also, the price of good orchard land was beyond what we thought we should consider. The area today is a cluster of tract houses. Our senses were right. This site would not have worked out. We also looked as far away as Traction Meadow on the Stockton Terminal in Eastern at the east end of their trackage. I don't think it was a serious consideration, but we scouted it out. I remember going out to Tick Canyon, a canyon coming off of Soledad Canyon in Santa Clarita. On weekends, Don Brown worked on a pig farm owned by a fellow worker at Sunkist Growers where Don was an artist. There was a narrow gauge rail line that ran from a quarry in Tick Canyon to a point where it transferred the quarried material with the SP. Don felt it was worth checking out. Today, the area is all homes. It would have been a terrible choice, and it was all upgrade. It would have been a very steep streetcar line. We looked at Winchester, just east of Perris. The thought was perhaps we could buy a section of land and build a large loop line. We had looked at the current Perris site early on and discounted it. The Pacific Railroad Society's Mount Rubidoux chapter held a lease from the land's owner, the Santa Fe Railroad. The goals of our two organizations did not seem to match, so we moved on to consider other sites. One of them was a portion of the long-abandoned Lakeview branch of the Santa Fe, which took off at Lakeview Junction just north of Perris. We also looked at the Elsinore end of the Santa Fe's Elsinore branch and at DeClesville, which was on the SP near Fontana. There was a Y with a long spur going south to a farm or ranch that was given some consideration. For a time we thought of approaching the city of Los Angeles about building our operating museum in Griffith Park. We envisioned running a line from Traveltown all the way south to the Los Feliz entrance of the park along the lines of what the city did with the Oahu Railway equipment, only longer. The idea didn't gain a lot of traction, being that we'd have to deal with the city bureaucracy. There may have been some initial discussions, but deep down we knew we needed to have our own property. We felt we needed to have a place where we owned the land and we could build our museum. We knew we didn't want to stay at Traveltown. There was no question that we had to move, and we didn't have a long time to do it. Coupled with the search for land was the search for 600-volt DC generating equipment. One day a group of us were in the South Bay and we decided to see if the old Pacific Electric Hawthorne substation still had its generating equipment. The thought was, if it did, perhaps the PE would be willing to donate it or sell it to us for scrap value. As best as I can remember, I was joined in this caper by Bill Bauer, Don Brown, Pat Underwood, and maybe one or two others. Don was able to somehow climb up on the roof and open the transom to look inside. He came over to the roof's edge and was about to report his findings to us, and instead found that about 3 Hawthorne police officers were questioning us as to what we were up to. They told Don to come down and then marched us across the street to the police station, where they placed us in a holding cell as they checked us out. We actually experienced the sound of a jail door clanking shut behind us. That was sobering. We asked them to call the Pacific Electric Special Agents Office at 6th and Main and tell Officer Sid Rose that we were being held there. Officer Rose knew us. He knew we were a pain in the behind, but we were otherwise harmless. We never really knew what happened to get us released, but within an hour we were out, without being booked, but with the instruction to leave and not come back. Oh, by the way, there was no electrical generating equipment remaining in the substation building. Everything really changed on the morning of Saturday, February 22, 1958. A rented Greyhound tractor-trailer arrived from Traveltown to a point 1 mile south of the town of Perris, carrying LATL flat car 9614 and enough rail and ties to lay 2 car lengths of track. It also carried our hope that we had truly found the location that would permit us to fulfill our dream of building an operating railroad museum. This location on the Santa Fe Railroad's former right-of-way to San Diego through the Perris Valley was to be our new home. We immediately started the task of building an unloading ramp adjacent to the future main line. We began with shovels, and through the generous help of local resident Jerry Burton, we were able to mechanize the process and quickly move the ramp to completion. After a cold night sleeping in our cars, the truck was moved across what was to become our main line at the Alpine Drive crossing. It was then backed into the ramp to begin the process of unloading the LATL 9614. Ties were unloaded from the truck and positioned on a newly graded track bed. We then put into place enough rail to build 2 car lengths of track. President Pat Underwood did the honor of driving the museum's first spike. Pat then took control of the skip loader, and with Bill Bauer as his brakeman, the 9614 became the first car to roll onto museum rails. By the end of the weekend, we were exhausted, but we were extremely fulfilled. Just 1 week later, the next action in consolidating the collection at Perris was underway. Things were happening quickly. San Diego Transit System had been asking us to remove the 508 from their property for some time. The 508 was part of a group of 8 PCCs purchased by San Diego Mill Supply Company in August of 1957. We were able to stall the move long enough to prevent the need to move the car to Travel Town, only to have to move it again to the Perris Museum site a short time later. This meant that on February 28, 1958, the Friday following the LATL 9614's move to Perris, we were in San Diego loading the 508 onto a haddock rig for the trip to Perris. It was helpful that member Mike Haddock's father owned a trucking company. The addition of the 508 to our collection was significant. The 508 was a part of the historic San Diego West Coast inauguration of PCC car service. As the Haddock truck with the 508 rolled down D Street, entering Perris, dark rain clouds moved in to add mud to the challenges of this very busy 2-week period. But we did it. Soon the rest of the narrow-gauge streetcar collection at Travel Town was moved to Perris. We were in desperate need of rails and ties at Perris to accommodate the cars. An abandoned P.E. spurred vineyard adjacent to the old Santa Monica via Beverly Hills line became available to us through the courtesy of former P.E. customer Woodhead Lumber Company. The rail was in pavement and badly rusted, and the ties were even worse. All this rust and rot was trucked to Perris on a rented semi and was relayed on 3-foot tie spacing in what was christened East Park Yard, which was just east of the current Broadway trackage. Pat Underwood had found Radish and Ferguson Trucking Company. They had a low-bed tractor-trailer rig that was well-suited for the transport of our cars. In fairly short order, all the cars were at Perris. As Ray puts it, we had 8 acres, 11 cars, 11 car lengths of rusty track, no fences, roads, electricity, gas, water, no toilet facilities, no place to eat or sleep or to get a cool drink. We were finally in heaven. The acquisition of LATL car 1450 took place in 1959 after we had departed Travel Town. Ray Ballish says the car cost $500. We had a last ride fan trip on the car before it was transported to Perris. Early June of 1958 saw us working on line car PE00157 at the former Pacific Electric Fairbanks yard in Long Beach. The task was to round out the line car's wheels so the Santa Fe would accept it, along with the PE00150 trolley greaser, for transport to Perris by rail. We hired a welder to place metal on the flat spots. After a short test drive, we were on our way. I was caretaker on the portion of the move from Butte Street Yard to High Grove. I was asleep in my sleeping bag in the 00157. Early in the morning of Friday, June 6, 1958, I was awakened by a jolt when Santa Fe switch engine 2336 coupled to the cars. It pulled the 2 cars from P.E.'s Butte Street Yard and brought them to Santa Fe's 9th Street Yard to be added to the rear of a freight headed out the 3rd District for San Bernardino. We were told the cars would travel at the end of a local freight, but we actually had a much faster ride than I expected. I really don't think we were on a local freight. The cars were set out on a siding at High Grove to await the San Jac local for the trip to Perris. It was a real nail-biter trip going up the Box Springs grade. We were told our cars would be at the very end of the train, behind the caboose. Instead, the 00150 trolley greaser was positioned in the consist ahead of and pulling the weight of the 00157, a boxcar, and the train's caboose up the hill. Somehow it all stayed together. The joke amongst us was the termites in the 00150 must have all been holding hands. One of the joys of the early days of the museum was the opportunity to ride mainline freight trains and, on the branch, to ride the locomotive of the San Jac Local in the capacity of caretaker for the movement of our cars. These two cars were a good fit in the museum's Pacific Electric collection. The 00150 trolley greaser was built as a tower car in 1899 by PE predecessor Los Angeles Pacific. The 00157 was built at the Pacific Electric 7th and Alameda shops in 1915, entering service as car 1730. British Columbia Electric Railway's last passenger run occurred early on February 28, 1958, when the Marpole-Steveston line was abandoned. The St. Louis Car Company built BC Electric 1225 in 1912. We believed it is an excellent example of the American interurban car building art. Worthy of preservation, we took on what was our most ambitious project to date. We bought the 1225 and working with the Great Northern Railway, the Western Pacific, and the Santa Fe, we arranged for the car's movement from Vancouver, British Columbia to Perris on its own wheels. And we were able to fit in a 2-day fan trip on the remaining electrified remnant of the Sacramento Northern Railway between Marysville and Yuba City, California. Museum co-founder Herb Rutledge traveled to Vancouver to ride as caretaker for the car's trip from Vancouver to the Western Pacific shops of Sacramento. For 3 weekends following the 1225's arrival at Sacramento, museum work crews traveled from Los Angeles to Sacramento in order to prepare the car for the Sacramento Northern fan trip. We left for Sacramento as soon as our work week ended on Friday afternoon and began the return trip to Los Angeles mid to late Sunday afternoon to return to our day jobs on Monday morning. On Saturday and Sunday, June 14th and 15th, 1958, the beautiful interurban car graced rails formerly polished by equally magnificent interurban cars of the Sacramento Northern Railway and staged meets with the famed California Zephyr. BCER 1225 performed flawlessly. And as fate would have it, the museum's own Sacramento Northern Freight Motor 653, while still in service on the SN, switched the 1225 at the end of the weekend to prepare it for the continuation of the trip south to Perris. After the Western Pacific handed the 1225 off to the Santa Fe, I acted as caretaker riding the car from Calway Yard in Fresno to Bakersfield. Unlike the 00150 and 00157 moved to Perris, this time the Santa Fe made sure our collectible was trailing the caboose, which made the trip up Box Springs grade much less stressful. The story of the move from Traveltown to Perris would not be complete without talking about the move of the LA Railway 9400. It and the Mack truck were the last pieces of our equipment to depart and closed the Traveltown chapter of our history. The 9400, a former LA Railway emergency car, was by the time we acquired it a car body and served as our clubhouse and meeting room at Traveltown. After securing a 2-day DMV permit to move the unlicensed, uninsured, ball-tired Mack truck to Perris, we winched the 9400's body onto the bed of the Mack truck and departed Traveltown. The first stop was an overnight stay parked on Sunset Boulevard in front of Hardship Towers of Hollywood. The next morning, the Mack with the 9400 departed for Perris. It was quite a sight, with several of us taking turns feeding the Mack's carburetor with gasoline from a 5-gallon gas tank while riding the Mack's running board. Did I forget to say the Mack's fuel pump didn't work and the internal gas tank was not usable? And when we got to Elsinore, we filled up the gas can at a Union 76 gas station that still had the old-style birdcage gravity gas pumps. What a sight that was. The Mack with the 9400 finally arrived at the museum without incident. The move to Perris was quite a rushed activity. Some aspects were well thought out, others maybe not so. We basically had access to a strip of land, the Santa Fe Railroad owned former California Southern Railroad right-of-way, for a mile or so south of Perris. To do so, we, OET, became a member of the Pacific Railroad Society's Mount Rubidoux chapter as they held the lease from the Santa Fe. We knew we needed to acquire land adjacent to the right-of-way to have a base of operations. About the time we arrived, John and Betty Aller, a family that owned a 10-acre parcel at and east of the right-of-way, accessed at today's Alpine Drive, were going through a divorce. By mid-1958, they were willing to sell us 8 acres with direct access to the right-of-way while they kept the 2 acres with their house. We had an option to purchase the remaining 2 acres at a future date. We seem to recall paying $400 or $500 per acre for the 8 acres. All we could afford, barely, was the 8 acres. I think the loan was co-signed by Pat Underwood and Herb Redlick. Both were aerospace engineers with established careers. We eventually bought the 2 remaining acres for $4,000, a higher $2,000 per acre because it had a house and a well. The 10 acres is basically the perimeter of today's loop line. As mentioned, the 2 acres included their house, which is the small old structure that still stands just east of the museum's bookstore. The house had a kitchen and a wood-burning stove used for cooking and for heating the house in the winter, and a small bedroom. There was a kind of shed on the side of the house that someone had built over the years, not a part of the original structure. It's gone now, but we made it into our bunkhouse. We bought 7 or 8 bunks, whatever would fit, so we could accommodate at least the 14 guys that started the museum. The bunks were assigned. I had my bunk every weekend. We'd come out there on Friday night and not leave till late Sunday afternoon. Getting up in the morning in the winter, it would be cold. First guy up would get the wood-burning stove going in the kitchen and put on some coffee. It was a lot of fun. The area was still very rural, not a bedroom community, nothing like what it is today. Our neighbor was Farmer Smith. The area was a potato-producing area, big time. It was a very large part of the economy. The Santa Fe brought long drags of reefers in and out of the valley during the harvest. OET, as we were then known, participated in the Perris Valley Potato Festival every year. Following the harvest, the festival began with a parade up D Street to a point near City Hall that served as the fairgrounds. We had a float in the parade and a booth where we would display items and photos to promote the museum. At harvest time, Farmer Smith told us that once they had left the field next to our property, we were welcome to go into the field and take whatever potatoes were still in the ground. We would take the potatoes right from the ground into the bunkhouse and boil them up. We'd build a meal around them. There was nothing like the taste of freshly harvested potatoes. As I said, it certainly was a fun time. Our first operating power source was a diesel-electric generator purchased in the spring of 1959 from the Warwick Railway Company of Providence, Rhode Island. It had come from a Pennsylvania Railroad diesel-electric car. We paid $650 for it, delivered. Don Brown financed it with a loan from the credit union at his employer Sunkist Growers, which was co-signed by Ray Balish. It was delivered to the museum on the bed of a semi-truck. We winched it off the truck onto the bed of our 1919 Bulldog Mack truck. To the north of the location for the power plant was the trunk of an old tree. We put a snatch block on the tree trunk with some lumber for a ramp and winched the power plant off the back of the Mack truck. That tree trunk determined the location of our first power plant. Though the diesel generator was operational, we did not have any batteries to start it. 2 or 3 of our cars with hoods up and batteries jumpered together was standard operating procedure at first. Also, the generator did not come with a radiator. Someone came up with a big truck radiator. Its fan was run off an electric motor. To run the motor, we had an electric cord from the Owler's house, but the current requirement was too great to start the motor. We had to wrap a cord around the fan's hub, and 2 or 3 of us would run with the cord to get the RPM so the AC power could sustain the fan's operation. We then dug 2 or 3 holes adjacent to the generator and buried 55-gallon drums which acted as mufflers. We used one of the Bellflower Line passenger shelters as a roof over the generator. Sometime in the fall of 1959 we were ready to fire up the generator and actually operate a car or 2. I wish I could be more precise as to the date and time we operated our first car, but after conferring with fellow founding members, unfortunately that moment in history is lost to the ages. Anyway, the preparations took longer than expected. It was dark when the generator was finally up and running. Our first roll of trolley wire didn't arrive until December of 1959. So instead, we had strung a roll of guy wire that we had on hand. The first car we tried to operate was the LATL 1450. We put up the pole and the lights came on and the compressor started, but we couldn't get the car to move. Next we went to the LATL 1423. Which came to life and was the first car to operate at the museum. I remember going to Tower Car LATL 9351 and moving it about a car length or so. For the first time in our lives, we were able to put up a trolley pole and operate a streetcar and not have to ask permission. The excitement we felt that evening was truly exhilarating. The streetcars we had worked on for years before that evening, so still and quiet, immediately came to life. Lights were on, compressors running. In that moment, we had at last become an operating trolley museum.